Good morning, everybody. My name is Kyle Houchins. I'm a tech and a trainer for McNeil, and this is Getting Started Rhino for Windows. And today, these sessions, by the way, if you haven't joined one of these before, they're intended to be interactive through the chat, not through your mic. So if you have any questions or anything like that, or I do something that you're like, whoa, what in the world was that? Hit the chat, let me know. I'll jump in and try to answer that on the fly, and if I need to do a little side quest and have a little different example or something like that, I'll do that along the way. But this is not like a typical software demo. It's not a polished thing. The way that I do these is the night before or the day of, I actually sit down and do a little sketch, and then I put it away and I don't look at it again. This is not pre-built. There's no Julia Child stuff going on here where I'm going to pop it out of the oven and it's going to be done and beautiful. You're going to see how the sausage is made from the beginning to the end, and this is the first time I've looked at this sketch since I did the sketch and put it away. So I haven't built it before, I haven't practiced it before, and if you've seen any of my other demos, you'll be like, yeah, no, he actually doesn't practice this, because sometimes they go right into the fan. And if they do, we'll sit and talk about that and try and figure out what went wrong, and hopefully there'll be a little learning that we can pull out of the mess of this thing. So today, what we're going to do is build this object that was a fairly formidable object in the development of my own youth. This vintage game controller. There's a museum in Seattle called the Mopop, which if you come to Seattle, you got to check it out. It's very cool. Turns out it started out, I believe, as Paul Allen's toy collection and has turned into a museum. And they had this vintage joystick from one of the old games that I used to play in the 70s and early 80s. And I thought, what a cool thing, because even though this is a fairly simple object, and if we look at this thing, it is actually a very simple object, there's a lot of opportunity to talk about features in Rhino that you might not have used before. And I definitely want to talk about that because there's some power here that people are leaving on the table if you are coming from an older version into Rhino 8. So let's jump into this. The one thing I will asterisk this with is the designer who drew this sketch. It was me. I drew the sketch. Did the modeler dirty. It's me. I'm the modeler. By doing a perspective sketch instead of an orthogonal foreview. So we've got some interpretation work to do to try and figure out how to translate this thing from 3D into 2D. And I started doing that a while ago just because I've been doing these for years. And the foreviews are kind of, that's easy, right? When somebody hands you a foreview, you're like, 75% of your work is done. So especially with simple objects, I try to add a little additional difficulty for myself because my life is not difficult enough as it is, and come up with some things that you might face in your own design work. Somebody walks in and tosses a sketch over your wall and says, build this. And you're like, this is not buildable form. And so how do we go from something like this garbage little sketch to a model? And because I'm old and because I'm an American, I'm working in inches. So everybody in Europe, you can stifle your giggles and laugh at me for using imperial measurements, but that's where we are. So I'm going to work in inches. I've got 30 years of muscle memory built up as far as wall thicknesses and stuff like that in inches, and I haven't translated that into millimeters yet. I do when I do client work, but it always hurts my brain and trying to do it live. You don't need to watch me try and do math. So let's get started with this. And the first thing I always try to do is a little chalk talk about strategy and what we're going to do. And if we analyze this thing, right, it's a fairly simple shape. It's a rounded square and it's extruded. And it has some chamfered edges. We got a little chamfer going on here. It's got rounded corners, so we're going to have a little chamfer going around a corner here. It's got a raised object. It's got some raised details here. It's got a button that's got a little bit of a sculpted shape, and then it's got this joystick with this little silicone gator. And so we're trying to attack each one of those things kind of from simplest to most complex, because I like to try and put off the hard things to the end. And so the first thing we need to decide is kind of how big this thing is. And I'm going to just start with this thing and I'm in the front view. Actually, I should probably be in the top view. So let's do that. So let's go into foreview. By the way, to get an image in, if you're really new here, the way that we do this is we run the picture command and we find our image And I'm going to put this in the top view instead this time. And we're going to put it, just drag it into the scene. Once it's into the scene, if we were going to build over it, if we go to our material stack over here and click on the material that makes up this image, we have some control over here as far as making it more or less transparent. Because we're not actually going to be building over this, I'm going to just leave it at full transparency, and I'm going to kind of just tuck it up here in the corner and use it as reference. But we're going to start in the top view, and we're going to start with our rounded rectangle. And if I poke this and go from the center, I'm going to say 0 is going to stab it in the center. I think I might go ahead and round the corners in the original curve. And I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and that's going to constrain it to a square. So this thing is about 4 1/4, 4 1/2 square. I'm going to just go 4 1/2 because it's you know, pretty easy to manage. And then for the corners, I'm going to just eyeball them, and I probably shouldn't do that, but it's my video. I'll do what I want. And we'll go something like that. Now, we have no idea exactly how thick this thing is, so we're going to experiment with a couple of thicknesses and just see how it feels. And in this case, I'm going to go to the gumball. I'm going to click the extrude dot in the Z direction, and because the arrow is going in the direction that I want, I'm going to use positive values. And so let's start with like 1 1/2 and see how that feels. And that actually feels, from a proportional point of view, kind of how 10-year-old me remembers this, right? They were kind of chunky. Maybe we drop it 1/4 of an inch. If I Shift Control click the top and I drop it -0.25, go something like that. Actually, that feels better. I think I like that. So let's use this as our base, right? And the next thing that I might want to tackle just to put this in is I might want to throw the chamfer in here just to get it out of the way. And I'm going to come in here under the solid tools. I'm going to chamfer the edge. I'm going to double click the edge, and it's going to bring me up a little chamfer icon. And I'm going to, first of all, change this to like 0.25 maybe. And then I'm going to preview it to see what it looks like. And that is definitely too big because these corners are pinching in too much. So let's do 0.125. And that feels, again, I'm kind of going off of muscle memory, how I remember these things to feel. Let's do 0.1. That actually kind of feels familiar. So let's leave it at that. And it has a similar one on the bottom, so I'm going to double click, and I'm going to use the set all 0.1 and run that. Now, if we go into rendered mode and we look at this thing, and I go over here to rendered mode and I shut my surface edges off, you can see that we end up with a rendered object, and it's hard to see because it's white, so let's put a plastic on it, and I'm going to make this black and just drop it on there so we can see it. Now, one of the things that chamfers do is they leave this hard kind of laser edge, and I don't love that because when you render it, it looks a little uncanny valley, right? Anytime you have a really sharp edge on something, it looks a little fake and a little CG, especially when you're rendering it. And so what I might want to do, and in the spirit of not ever leaving anything well enough alone, let's actually go in and Control-Shift-Click all of the surfaces that chamfer made and delete them. And then let's replace it with a blend surf, which lives over here, which is probably my favorite tool in Rhino. If it was a real tool, the paint would definitely be worn off the edges. And let's auto-chain the edges, and let's set this to tangency. And you're like, hey, stupid, you switched from a chamfer to a fillet. Yes, I did. But if I click the lock here and I drag the sliders, I now can flatten this out, and it's tangent at the edges, but it's kind of flattish in the middle. And I can actually override this to like 0.15. and flatten that out a little bit more. The slider stops at 0.25, but you can actually override it. So I can even go even farther. I can go 0.1 and flatten that out. And then we end up with this shape, and our render mesh is a little wonky. We can fix that. But this shape, if we look at the points, right, we've got 2 tangent points right here, and then we've got 2 tangent points right here. So that what we end up with when we run this is instead of that harsh CG looking chamfer, we end up with something that has 2 little fillets on the top and the bottom, and they're just that little hint of light that chases around that edge there feels more like a real object as opposed to this down here, right? See how that's just lasered out like that, and then this has just got this little softness to it. And let's fix our render mesh so that we get the benefit of all of this subtle work that we've just done. And I'm going to change my render mesh using the detail controls. And I'm going to switch the maximum edge to surface distance. If I look at my units, my model units are inches and my absolute tolerance is 0.001. If I go back to MASH and I set my maximum edge to surface distance to 0.001, which matches my file tolerance, it's going to give me a slightly more detailed mesh. And if I go to preview that, we can't see it because we're in rendered mode. And then I'm going to switch let me do this in shaded mode so we can see what's going on. So let's do that again. Tools, Options, Mesh. Everybody know what I'm talking about when I say render mesh? So the render mesh is the actual mesh that's calculated when Rhino sends something to your video card to display it. And so the render mesh is not actually real. It's not actually part of your model, and it's not actually something that you need to worry about, generally speaking, unless you start to get faceting in your corners when you do renderings. If that happens, then what we're going to do is we're going to say, maybe we're going to change the first setting we changed is the maximum edge surface to distance, and that added some polygons. We've still got some really big polygons in here, which are okay for a render mesh, but maybe we want to modify that. If I change this to like 1/4 inch as far as the maximum edge length and then preview it, you can see that we get more polygons in there, right? The largest polygon edge that we're going to end up with is 1/4 inch. And the tighter we make this, the more polygons that end up happening in here. And we're not going to do simple planes. And we get a very nice breakup of quads on this kind of things, which means that this thing is actually going to render really nicely. So when we go into rendered mode, now we can see all of the work that we did right in there. Okay. So the cool thing about this now is you can see that this has just the tiniest little bit of crown to it in these 2 little fillets. And this is a much nicer chamfer than this one is. So let's go ahead and replace these. And I'm going to do this in shaded view. And I'm Control-Shift clicking because this is a poly surface, a closed poly surface at this point. I'm going to Control-Shift click these surfaces and just delete them, which allows me to sub-object select. I'm going to run the cell curve command and hide my initial curve, and then I'm going to run blend surf one more time with the same settings we had before. Chain edges auto, and I'm going to set this to lock, and I'm going to do 0.1 and 0.1, and then I'm going to run it. And we end up with, essentially now, our completed base of this thing. Now, one of the things that was kind of iconic of this object is it had a parting line right down the center, which the more you played, it had a little sharp edge on it, and the more you played, it would like kind of burn a hole in your pinky finger. So we gotta put that in, right? Because that's an iconic object, an iconic part of this thing. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a center line curve, and I'm just gonna draw out like that, and I'm going to use gumball with snappy dragging, and I'm going to snap that to the midpoint here. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say snappy dragging, right click on the gumball settings. There are 2 settings in here, smooth dragging and snappy dragging. If you run this snappy dragging and then you have your O snaps set up to be O-snappy, the gumball will respect the O-snaps. Now, you'll notice that I have my O-snaps set up here, but I have it checked as disabled, right? The reason I have that set as disabled is the Alt key is the temporary enable disable. And because I have all of my snaps turned on, as I'm dragging this around, you'll notice nothing snapping, right? And I like that because if you don't do that, right, let's take that off, and we drag this around, it kind of gets a little schizophrenic on you and is like, snap, 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 and you're like, nah, stop it, stop it, stop it. And so what I tend to do is I will run this disabled, and then I can hold down the Alt key and then find a snap and then let go. And then that way I can get the benefits of the snaps without having that like constant noise of the thing trying to snap everywhere and throughout the entire model. Okay. So now we've got this curve established. We know it's in the center. There is another icon on the gumball in version 8 that a lot of people don't know what it does. This is the cut. And if I just drag this through, you'll notice it's going to just cut essentially and make a wire cut for the top and the bottom. Now, the next thing that we can do on this is I want to make a little lap joint. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the bottom. And I'm going to use a new command in Rhino 8 called inset. And I have a hotkey set up for that. And I'm going to pick to inset on this face. And I'm going to drag for a through point. And you'll notice that it is dragging an edge on this actual surface. Now, we've got some options up here. We've got loose, we've got ignore seams, we've got crease corners, we've got split, and we've got join outputs. I'm going to leave split set to no at this point because I just want a curve. I don't actually want it to break the surface in half. And I'm going to set my through point to 0.15, which is a little fat for a wall thickness. Actually, let's do 0.1. And we're going to set that right there. So I know I've got a 0.1 offset in here. Now, I'm going to do this again. And I'm going to, instead of using 0.01, I'm going to use 0.05, and that's going to give me a second offset there. Okay, so now this is a curve just on this surface, which is really nice because now I can use the push-pull command. I can pick this region, and I can just pull this in or out. And in this case, I'm just going to go up like 0.1, and it's going to give me a little thing like that. Now, if I was going to shell this thing, right, I could use push-pull, and I can actually just push this face down. And ideally, I would have figured out like where this wall thickness is and all that kind of stuff. Now, is this an exact shell? No, because it's not offsetting this. We would probably want to chamfer this edge if we wanted an actual offset. But in this case, we're going to consider that this is like an early prototype. We're not engineers. We're doing, looks like, works like kind of model. And we just need to make some space inside for some electronics. So I'm just going to use push-pull, and I'm just going to smash that down a little bit. Okay, I'm not gonna sweat that too terribly much. So the next thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna bring back the top, and we're going to make space for that lap joint, right? And if we look at where this thing lives, we need to basically just make a little space in here. Now we know that this edge, right? If we do inset again, I have a hotkey set up for inset, but the command is inset up here. And we're going to do the last inset distance that we did was 0.05, right? And it just fills that back in. Now, we don't really want 0.05 because that's going to be line to line. So let's do 0.045, and that's going to sneak that out just a hair, and that's going to give us just a little bit of room. So now that I've got that curve on that surface, I can use push-pull. Again, I have a hotkey set up for that, but the command actually is push-pull. And I'm going to pick this face, and I'm going to just squish it up a little bit. Maybe I'll just snap it to the bottom of the chamfer here. And that is going to give me essentially a part that is hollow, not shelled. I don't want to use the word shelled, but it's hollow, so that if I were to 3D print this, I would end up with a part that I could put stuff in, right? We'll just call it that. Now, if I was going to hand this to an engineer, I would probably leave the lap joint in, but I might not push the surface down so that they didn't have to mess with it. You'd have to work with your engineer. There's different engineers like different stuff and different things like that. Now, the only thing that we didn't do is we don't have the gap between these, right? So let's add that. And if I push pull this face like 0.01 up, and then I bring this one and I push pull this face down. Now I'm dragging down, you'll notice that it turns red. I'm not actually entering a value, I'm just right clicking. And what it's gonna do is it's gonna remember that the last move I did was 0.01 units. Whether I pull it up and right click or whether I pull it down and right click will determine whether it's adding 0.01 or subtracting 0.01. So that's a nice little interface thing. Now, ideally, if we were going to be kind to our users, we would fillet this edge. And the people in the 70s didn't care. They just left it sharp. And I have the callus on my inside of my pinky finger to prove it. But let's be better. So let's add just a little tiny fillet on the edge of that because kids these days are soft. And I'm going to just drag this in. Something really tiny like 0.02 is probably plenty. Maybe even 0.01. That's plenty. Double click to select the entire edge. It's going to remember what we added to it. And then we're going to look and say, that looks like, for a rounded box, it's about as nice of a rounded box as we're ever going to get. All right, so let's move on and look at the next part of this, which is this bezel that makes up, the base for the button and all that kind of stuff. The way that this thing is actually set up in the model, my drawing is not entirely accurate. It's actually slightly off-centered, so this all fits slightly registered to the bottom. Actually, this is actually the top. The button is actually up in the upper left-hand corner because it was designed for right-handed kids. We didn't care about left-handed kids in the 70s, even though we should have. But this was set up where this is actually the upper left-hand corner. This is actually the top of the controller, and the joystick was actually registered slightly south of the center line. So let's kind of figure out where that is. And I'm going to use a new feature in Rhino 8, which is auto seaplane, and I'm going to enable that, and then I'm going to Control-Shift-Click this top face, and you're going to see what happens is the seaplane jumps to that face. And that's actually kind of cool because now I can draw on that face using the origin, and I'm going to eyeball this. Anybody with an engineering mindset, every time I say that, they go, ugh. I'm going to eyeball this. And then I'm going to stick the other one kind of right in here. And that's going to kind of determine about the proportions on that. And maybe we're going to slide this a little bit south of the center line. And we're going to poke this more up in the corner. And if we look at that from top view, we can decide whether or not we like those proportions. Maybe this needs to be just a bit bigger, like that, and then come in a little bit. I'm using nostalgia measurements here, so this is all stuff that I'm like, yeah, that feels like a 30-year-old memory. All right, so I'm gonna drag this in somewhere in here. Actually, let's use an actual tool for this. If I come in here, there is a tangent from curve, And so let's pick kind of right about there. And then let's bring this in. We'll call it something like that. And then I'm going to just copy this curve using gumball. I'm going to drag it and tap Alt. And then I'm going to relocate the gumball to the end. And then I'm going to drag this over till it touches. And we want that to be kind of right in there. All right. So that's going to give us kind of our outline. And so if we drag this and run Curve Boolean, which is a tool I'm always amazed at how many people don't know or use, I can just click outside this and get my final shape. Okay, so we've got a little bit more work to do. We're going to add another curve to the center in order to get that kind of detail ring that runs around the outside, right? This little ring with this little details in there, and that actually probably could be a little smaller. And that gives us our curves that we can then simply just run the push-pull command and add that, okay? Push-pull is like this delightful little thing that just the developer on that's name is Joshua Kennedy, and he's fairly new to the Rhino crew. And dude has just been killing it. He was just like, hey, is this cool? Do we like this? And everybody's like, what? So yeah, so push-pull is super rad. We really like that a lot because it allows you to be able to just, especially combined with auto C-plane, where I can like click on this face and draw something, and then click on this face and draw something, and then click on here and draw something with the C-plane jumping each time. It gives you a lot of flexibility to be able to just really move quickly, especially in 3D space. So let's clean this thing up a little bit. Actually, let's finish dialing this in. So I'm going to actually snap to C-plane to here, and then let's find the center, and let's locate our button, and we're going to call that kind of about there, and then I'm going to push-pull this down, and it looks like that button should actually not violate this. So let's not do that. So let's take this and make this a little smaller. And let's move this out like that. And actually, let's go backwards a little bit. I want to make sure that this actually lays out nicely, because I think the proportions on this aren't exactly correct. I think this needs to be smaller. And somewhere out here like that. That gets us out of there, and then this. I don't like that anymore, so let's fix that. And I'm going to copy paste and then shift drag on my scale handle to get what the outline of this thing should be. Kind of like that feels about right. So let's get rid of this. Shift Control click on the curve, not the surface. Delete that, and then we'll go to the top view, and let's add a curve from here in like that, and then I'm going to copy paste. I'm going to just drag Shift Alt, and then I'm going to relocate the gumball by clicking the center and snapping it to the end, and then just snap it out here, and I want that kind of there like that. That feels a little bit better to me. Let's extend this curve using the extend curve command, which lives down here. And I'm just going to bring that back, and then we'll grab these guys again, and we'll curve Boolean. That gives us that. I like that better. I think that's a better layout. So let's run our push pull again, and it's going to remember the last value. And because this one was part of that curve set, you can see that it actually even gave us the the detent for the button, which is nice. And so we can add the button by using offset. And I'm going to offset that like 0.05. Actually, I'm going to drag it using the through point because I just want a teeny little bit. And then we can push-pull the button up. That's probably plenty. And then let's throw a blend on the corner. And I'm going to use blend instead of fillet, which is the right click on the fillet command. And I like blend over fillet because it uses continuity instead of just throwing a ball fillet in there. So it's a different shape. You'll notice that this is not an arc. And I actually like that because I think it looks better. All right. And then the center of this is actually slightly depressed, and we can do that a couple of different ways. And I think the way that I want to do it is I'm going to drop a point. If I look at wireframe, when I shift control clicked on this center point, because it was a circular object, Auto C-Plane was able to find the center of that object. So now if I just hit 0, I can drop a point right in the center of this face. And I'm going to now delete this face, and I'm going to take this point and I'm going to drop it just a hair like that. And then I've got a couple of options. There is the patch command. I can pick this edge and this point, and I can make a little button like that. I don't want to adjust the tangency. I want it to be just sharp on the edges. And it gives me a shape, but it's kind of not quite the shape that I'm looking for. It's a little, I mean, it's not bad. It's a little flumpy, but it's not awful. Let's do a better version of it though. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the line command, and I'm going to start a line right here, and then I'm going to just draw a line straight up in space. And that's going to give me a point vertical from the center of this thing. And now what I'm going to do is draw another line from any random point in this thing, but let's pick a fairly XY setup just to make our lives easy. And let's do, I don't know, something like that. Plenty. All right, so now we have a straight line from the center point out to our edge. I'm going to change degree on this curve to make it a degree 3 curve, and the reason I'm going to do that is because that's now going to give me 4 points. What I know about tangency is if this point and this point are lined up, the curve is going to be tangent at that point. If this point and this point are lined up, the curve is going to be tangency at that point. So I'm going to drag these curves down to snap to there, and then I'm going to drag this point. I'm going to use the C-plane waffle so that it stays in the same plane, and I'm going to be able to determine how much tangency there is of this curve at this point. And if I use snappy dragging to make sure that it snaps to that edge, I now know that this curve is tangent to this surface, and this is going to be tangent across the center line. Then I can use a tool called rail revolve, which is kind of cool. Again, I'm always kind of surprised at how many people don't know that this tool exists. It's a right click on the revolve, and this is your profile curve. This is your rail, and then this is the revolve point. And what it does is it just runs a revolve using a shape. And because we did this with history, if I were to modify this, we can now iterate and do all sorts of stuff with that. But I'm actually happy with the way that lives, so I'm going to just join this up. Now, this is the intent of this, kind of like in the back of my mind, is that we're going to send this to a 3D printer or something like that to be able to hold it in our hand and say, yeah, this is the shape that we want. So I don't really want this to break up in a bunch of different pieces. So I'm going to leave this as a solid poly surface, but I'm going to add a new material. And that new material, we'll just make it red. And for the pew pew button here, we'll just Control-Shift select, Control-Shift click these 3 surfaces, and then right-click assign. And that gives us a sub-object assignment. Even though this is still a closed poly surface, we can assign different materials to this, you know, throughout the process and be able to have one model for rendering and printing. We don't have to break it up into different pieces. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is we're just going to knock these edges off. And again, I'm going to use blend just because I like the fact that blend works off of continuity instead of just throwing a ball in there, because ball fillets, depending on how, you know, sensitive your eyes are to this stuff. I've been looking at this stuff for a really long time. And I can pick out a SolidWorks model a million miles away because they use ball fillets for everything. And they look really, what's the right word? Crappy. Crappy is the word that I'm trying to think of. To me, I don't, they're just not pretty. It just looks like you just dragged a Dremel through the tool and made a fillet. So I'm not a big fan of that stuff. And so I tend to use blends because they work off of continuity. This is tangent instead of just smashing a ball in there. And I like that better. So let's do this. I'm not supposed to say things like crappy in my video. Sorry. And let's put a smaller one on there, maybe something even smaller. And then let's do the same thing on the inside. And that ends up with this really nice, see how that feels better than a ball fillet? It's a really subtle thing. And if you're not somebody who has spent a really long part of their life looking at this kind of stuff over and over and over again, it might not even make a difference to you. It does to me. So that's where we are. All right. Let's look at the next part of this, which is the details that go around here. And this is just a simple drafting problem, right? We just have to draw these little shapes and make an array and get that out. So let's draw these guys first, these little pupus shapes here. I don't know what those are, but we'll draw something like that. I'm going to do it in shaded mode. We may actually, let's do it in rendered mode, in shaded mode, and Control-Shift click here, which will stick our C-plane to there. So we're actually drawing right on that. And I'm going to give myself some little guides here, just so I have a reference point of where the center lines on that stuff are. And I'm going to kind of overdraw this. So I'm going to just drag from the center line and tap Alt, and that's going to give me a copy. And then I'm going to drag, let's see, maybe I should do that radially. Let's do that instead. That makes more sense. Let's copy paste, and then I'm going to stick Gumball here, and then I'm going to rotate this. And the farther I get away from Gumball with my mouse, the slower Gumball goes. So let's do that. And then I'm going to copy paste again, and I'm going to stick Gumball back here, and then we're going to rotate like that. And then we'll draw the outside of that top part like that. And then we'll draw the inside part of that like that. I don't know where my top one went. Oh. Something like that. And then was like a little kind of an arc shape in here. I might just fake that. And it's a little more biased in this direction. So let's grab all of these curves. And then I'm going to curve Boolean. I'm going to pick the inside of this that I want to keep. And in one shot, boop, it trims everything. And I get that. Let's mirror it. And then this mirrors this way. And then if we pick both of them and copy paste and rotate 90. We get those guys. Okay. So the next thing is the little hash marks that go in between there. And it looks like they're about the same size as the end of this thing. So let's just use that as a reference. So I'm going to copy paste, double click the center, drop gumball right here, and then I'm going to rotate that curve about there, maybe a little farther. Again, I'm using nostalgia measurements here. Control copy paste, stick the gumball back here, and we'll say that is about what we want. And then start at the center point. I'm going to just snap to there, start at the center point. I'm going to snap to there, grab these curves, and curve Boolean, doop. And then we're going to just do an array, transform array polar. That's going to be the center. And the number of items, I don't know, let's call it 12. And then the first, we're going to go from here to here. And 12 is too many, so let's go 10. That feels like still too many, so let's go 9. And that's probably pretty good. That one's the outlier. And I don't like the spacing on this, just visually. So I'm going to relocate my gumball to the center. And then I'm going to drag these so that I like them better. And then I'm going to just mirror. Select last, mirror, and then select last, mirror, and I've got my details. Now, here's the cool thing about push-pull. Now I can go push-pull, pick this surface, and I want to get rid of these curves for the time being because it's actually recognizing those. So let's push-pull again. And I want to invert. Boop. Now it's going to get those guys, and it gets all of them, and then I can just add that as a detail. Like that. It's going to think for a second, and then drop those in there. Now, they have a material on them, so let's go plastic material. And it's like this old kind of dank orange color. It's like 70s, like weird orange color, something like that. And then I'm going to go in the front view, and we're going to shift control drag all of those top faces. Not you. Oops. Oh, fine. We'll just do it this way. Shift control drag all that. Deselect the edges. That's fine. And then we're going to assign. And we've got that detail. Now, there was a little top icon in here. I'm not going to throw that in there. You can, if you wanted to replace one of these with the word top, you could do that, but I'm not going to worry about it. All right, so let's add the last component, which is this silicone gator. And this is going to be a revolved shape, right? We're going to go around the center. The joystick on this is actually a hexagon, not a circle, so that we will have a little bit of a blend thing to do there. But let's throw the hexagon in first because that'll give us a good reference point. There we go, staring right at it. All right, so we're going to drop that in the center, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 5. I actually want 6, and we'll drop that kind of in there. We'll push pull. Oops. Get it on that surface. Push-pull looks to see what surface the actual part is on. And so that's what it's looking for. So we're going to go probably about that. And then we'll knock the corners off of that just with blend. And I'm not going to worry about the bottom. Let's preview that. Those could be a little bigger. Maybe even a little bigger. That feels about right. Something like that. All right, so then the last thing that we need to do is we just need to design the gator that goes around this thing. And that, actually, we might be able to do a fun trick with this. So let's go into shaded mode. Let's set our auto seaplane to here. And then let's draw some circles starting at, let's set auto seaplane. There we go. That's finding the center. Let's set our auto seaplane there and then do circles, and let's add one there. And is that concentric? Yes. And then let's just copy paste, holding down shift, copy paste, hold down shift, copy paste, copy paste. This is going to be great if it works. In my mind, this is going to be awesome. We'll see if my world is kind. All right. So now, important part of this is we're going to record with history, and then we're going to use a loft, and we're going to just go boop, 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 like that. And we're going to just loft it, and we're going to use a normal loft, and we'll call that a day. Now, if the world is a kind and just place, I should be able to grab these edges like that and drag them up, and it should give us a gator, which it did. And then this edge, that curve, we can pull in, and then we can pull that up a little bit, and that will give us the basis for the blend between the two. Got one more curve in here that I want to mess with, like that. And because we did this with history, all we have to do is grab these curves and shift drag, and we can change the bias, we can change the height, because the height, actually, they come up a little bit as they come in. At least in my memory they do. There's going to be somebody out there going, that is not an accurate representation. Probably not. It's cool, man. It's all good. And then we're going to take this, and I'm going to just pull that out. I'll just snap it to the edge of that. And that gives us our little thing. And maybe I'll pull this one up a little bit more. History just lets you kind of play, and that's one of the things I really like about that tool, is it allows you to be able to just kind of get it the way you want it. Something like that. Plenty of spaces to catch all the Fruit Loops crumbs. All right, so let's cap that, and then I'm going to join that. And actually, let's not cap that. Let's not. Let's now hide this, and I'm going to delete those curves, which kills my history. Now, I'm going to do something a little counterintuitive. I'm actually going to Control-Shift-Click this surface and delete it, which is going to make this an open object now. If we look at my edges, this is now an open object, and this should be an open object as well. And then let's bring this and this, and let's work on the transition between these two. And in this case, I think what I want to do is I want to build a little blendy blend between those two. And so I'm going to just grab the bottom of this guy, and this should just let me drag it straight up. The reason it lets me drag it straight up is because this is all degree 1 geometry in the uppy downy direction here. And so when I move stuff, it doesn't distort, and that actually is ideally what we want to do. So if we look at this, this doesn't really give us any space to mess with this. So I'm going to just expand this out a little bit, and that looked like it didn't like that. So let's turn the points on and do it with the points instead. So let's grab that, and I'm going to expand that just a hair. And that gives us a little space now to actually make that blend happen. And then let's look and see what happens if we just run the blend surf between the two. And I'm going to chain the edges between here and here. And that gives us something like that. And I may want to do this with history so I can iterate. And let's back that off just a hair like that. And we'll call that good. Now, I'm not super stoked about the way that looks, so let's look at the points on this. And if I double click one of the control polygons of this edge, it gives me control over that specific edge. And I can do things like shift control this. And when I shift control it, you'll look and see what happens. The blend actually updates with history. This is something that's new. I think they threw history on the blend tool in 7, and it's awesome. So I get the transition on that a little bit better, and you can see that that blend is happening nicely. The other cool thing is blend itself, the blend surface actually has an edit option. And if I click on that, it's going to say, hey, look, it's going to light this up and say, you can actually edit this one. So I'm going to right click to accept that. And it's going to just reopen the blend dialog box, which allows me to be able to then go in and actually edit the blend again. So I've got a couple of levels of history here, which, again, this is a really simple object, but I liked this model because it gives us an opportunity to talk about some stuff that folks might have not seen in Rhino before. So let's go ahead and let's make a new material, and we're going to call this one, let's do a black plastic, but we're going to make this one matte. So we're going to leave the reflectivity high, but we're going to change the clarity down. And then let's assign this to this. And then what you get is this kind of shiny, because rubber actually is pretty reflective, but the reflections are pretty diffuse. And this clarity setting changes what happens to those reflections. And then it's smooth, but if we wanted to add a bump texture to it, we could. So let's join this all together. And then let's bring this back. And then we've just got this issue here between these two surfaces, and we can solve this a couple of different ways. We might be able to, actually, let's just see, did we fix it so that it would actually join? Oh yeah, we did. Okay, never mind. That actually joins up and makes a close bond surface because we snapped it. All right, so let's get this material reassigned. And so now we've got a difference between this material and this material. Now, that essentially gives us the end of our model, right? So we're at exactly an hour, which is what I'm supposed to be, even though I always go over. But let's talk about a little bit of finessing that we can do to this. If we add one more plastic material, and we're going to just, actually, let's not even do that. Let's do this instead. Let's copy this one. We're going to duplicate this one. That way we know all our settings match. But what we're going to do is we're going to add a speckle texture to it, and we're going to Control-Shift select this face, these faces, and the chamfer on this thing was semi-polished, but the body of the thing actually had this kind of sandblast texture on it. So let's right-click and do a sub-object assignment to those surfaces, and you can see that we get that. Now, that looks like hot garbage, so let's make this smaller. That feels about right, something like that. And I don't like the rubber feels just a little dead, so let's bring that reflections up just a hair, like that. I'm going to select that point and delete it. I'm going to hide my image or delete it. And then let's add a little drama to the scene by changing our camera length from 50 to 35. That's going to give us a little bit more perspective. And we'll just throw a ray trace on this. And double check that our speckle looks okay. And the speckle actually looks a little heavy, so let's go back to the extra small. That feels better. And then we can play with stuff like, do we like this environment or do we want to try a different environment? If we import, I like the Rhino 8 Automotive Studio. That one seems to be pretty nice. And then if we set that for all the channels, that feels a little cooler. And then we can check and see if rotating it does anything. And in this case, I don't think it does because it's a fairly even thing like that. And we can just let that run and call it a day. And you can see that we've got like a really nice, and the texture is starting to develop as the rendering gets more detailed. There's I'm running the NVIDIA denoiser, and the NVIDIA denoiser tends to do exactly what it's supposed to do, which is to get rid of noise. Well, this is essentially noise, and so it's trying to filter that out. As the rendering develops, the noise, which is what we want, actually comes back into focus and gives us the part that we're looking for. So 30 seconds, exactly an hour start to finish. We've got something that we can throw a presentation rendering out because it's done. We've got a part that we can do. We can select the top and the bottom, run the mesh command, export the mesh to a printer, and we can be printing. And we can go have lunch while the robots do our work, which is ideally, as a designer, what we're looking for anyways, right? Any other questions? If not, I will let you go. Thank you very much for joining. My name's Kyle Houchins. This is Getting Started Rhino for Windows. Go make great stuff. Thanks. Bye.